Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm joined here today by Vanita Gupta, the head of the department's Civil Rights Division, and Mark Giuliano, Deputy Director of the FBI. We are here today to announce that a federal grand jury in South Carolina has returned a 33-count indictment against Dylann Storm Roof, charging him with federal hate crimes and firearms charges for killing and attempting to kill African American parishioners at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, because of their race and in order to interfere with their exercise of their religion. As set forth in the indictment, several months prior to the tragic events of June 17th, Roof conceived of his goal of increasing racial tensions throughout the nation and seeking retribution for perceived wrongs that he believed African Americans had committed against white people. To carry out these twin goals of fanning racial flames and exacting revenge, Roof further decided to seek out and murder African Americans because of their race. An essential element of his plan, however, was to find his victims inside of a church, specifically an African American church, to ensure the greatest notoriety and attention to his actions. As alleged, Roof set out the evening of June 17, 2015, to carry out this plan, and drove to the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, known as Mother Emanuel. Mother Emanuel was his destination, specifically because it was an historically African American church of significance to the people of Charleston, of South Carolina, and to the nation. On that summer evening, Dylann Roof found his targets, African Americans engaged in worship. Met with welcome by the ministers of the church and his parishioners, he joined them in their Bible study group. The parishioners had Bibles. Dylann Roof had his .45 caliber Glock pistol and 8 magazines loaded with hollow point bullets. And as set forth in the indictment, while the parishioners of Mother Emanuel were engaged in religious worship and Bible study, Dylann Roof drew his pistol and opened fire on them, ultimately killing 9 church members. Now, as you know, the state of South Carolina is also prosecuting Roof for the murders, attempted murders, and firearms offenses that he's alleged to have committed. We commend the South Carolina state authorities for their tremendous work and their quick response. It is important to note, however, that South Carolina does not have a hate crimes statute, and as a result, the state charges do not reflect the alleged hate crimes offenses presented in the federal indictment returned today. Specifically, the federal indictment returned today charges Roof with 9 murders and 3 attempted murders under the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act. This federal hate crimes law prohibits using a dangerous weapon to cause bodily injury or attempting to do so on the basis of race or color. The Shepard-Byrd Act was enacted specifically to vindicate the unique harms caused by racially motivated violence. Roof is also charged with 9 murders and 3 attempted murders under a second federal hate crime statute that prohibits the use or threat of force to obstruct any person's free exercise of their religious beliefs. Finally, Roof has been federally charged with multiple counts of using a firearm in the commission of these racially motivated murders and attempted murders. For these crimes, Roof faces federal penalties up to life imprisonment or the death penalty. I note that no decision has been made on whether to seek the death penalty in this case. The department will follow our usual rigorous protocol to thoroughly consider all the factual and legal issues relevant to that decision, which will necessarily involve counsel for the defendant Roof. In addition, consultation with the victims' families is an important and vital part of this decision-making process, and no decision will be made prior to conferring with them. The family members of those killed at Emmanuel AME and the survivors were informed of these federal charges earlier today. I would also note that this indictment contains allegations, is not evidence of the defendant's guilt. Now, as you will recall, this federal grand jury indictment follows an announcement that I made on June 18th of 2015 that the Department of Justice was conducting a hate crimes investigation into the shooting at Emmanuel AME. Immediately following that shooting, the experienced prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office in South Carolina, along with experienced attorneys from our Civil Rights Division, began working closely with the FBI, ATF, state and local law enforcement officials, including the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, or SLED, the Charleston Police, and the Solicitor's Office for the Ninth Circuit of South Carolina, in thoroughly investigating these crimes. I would like to thank the many state and federal local law enforcement officials for their dedication, for their hard work to ensure that this investigation was conducted thoroughly and expeditiously. I would also like to thank South Carolina U.S. Attorney Bill Nettles for his and his office's tremendous efforts on this case, as well as the dedicated attorneys from the Department's Civil Rights Division. In particular, I'd also like to extend my thanks to Charleston Solicitor Scarlett Wilson for being a cooperative and effective partner in this matter. We have a strong working relationship with Solicitor Wilson and her office, and we look forward to our continued collaboration as these parallel state and federal prosecutions work their way through their respective court systems. Thank you for your attention. Any questions? Yes.
Who will go for South Carolina or the federal government?
That hasn't been determined yet. We're working cooperatively with Solicitor Wilson. Both cases will proceed through the court system. We will both work, however, to reduce any unnecessary burden to the families.
What factors go into that kind of decision?
Would be...
What factors go into deciding who goes first? Besides burden on the families, what other factors go into deciding?
There are any number of factors. We will consider how the cases are progressing through each system and essentially how the judges are viewing the case, state of motion practice. Both cases are in their early stages, have yet to have motions, so at this point it's difficult to say how that will impact on the schedule.
Judge.
Behind.
This would certainly seem to fit the definition of domestic terrorism. Were domestic terrorism charges considered in this case, and can you elaborate on that deliberation and what some of the problems could have been with bringing such charges?
Well, as you know, there is no specific domestic terrorism statute. However, hate crimes, as I've stated before, are the original domestic terrorism. And we feel that the behavior that is alleged to have occurred here is archetypal behavior that fits the federal hate crime statutes and vindicates their purpose. We have here a defendant who was alleged to have harbored discriminatory views towards African Americans, to have sought out an African American house of worship, one that was particularly noted because of its age and significance, and he also sought out African American parishioners at worship, implicating several hate crime statutes. And we think that this is exactly the type of case that the federal hate crime statutes were in fact conceived of to cover. Racially motivated violence such as this is the original domestic terrorism.
General Lynch, Pierre Thomas, ABC News. 2015, if you look at the essence of the case brought forth in the indictment, the fact that these people are dead today because of their race, that's primarily what you allege in the indictment. Could you just speak to where we stand and what that says, that this still exists?
Well, I think that this is obviously a tragic situation. This is obviously a troubling situation, as the allegations in the indictment reflect the mindset of this young man and his specific purpose to target individuals for death because of their race, but also to target individuals for death who are engaged in religious worship as well. So I think that we have to remain vigilant about these matters. We certainly at this point don't know much more about the defendant. The investigation is ongoing into a host of matters, including those motivations. But I think that the message that should be clear to this is that the federal government and our state partners are committed to investigating these matters fully and thoroughly, and where we have racially motivated violence, committed to acting.
Hi, ma'am. It says in the indictment that he targeted Mother Emanuel specifically because it was a historically African American church of significance to the people of Charleston, of South Carolina, and the nation. How do you know? How do you know that's why he chose that church as opposed to any African American church? How do you know it was the national significance of the church?
So I'm not going to comment specifically on the evidence that will come forth at a trial, except to note that we believe that the evidence will support the allegation that Ruth chose Mother Emanuel because it was an old church historic church, and that it was historically significant as one of the oldest African American churches, not just in South Carolina, but in the nation, and that he was looking for the type of church and the type of parishioners whose death would in fact draw great notoriety for his religious views, and his racist views, I should say.
I know that in your remarks you use the language "because of," and I'm wondering, as you present a case like this, to what extent must all other factors be precluded, such as mental illness, drug and alcohol addiction? If a defense lawyer gets up and says, actually, he hates everyone in the world, he hates his mother, he hates gays, tomorrow he's going to kill many more people who weren't black, what impact does that have?
Well, hopefully we would not be receiving information like that, although we would certainly act on it if we did. You know, wherever you have the possibility of multiple motivations, you also have the possibility of multiple charges. As you will note, the charges here specifically allege racially motivated violence in the murder and attempted murder of the victims of Mother Emanuel, but also the federal hate crime statute that prohibits using violence to essentially prevent anyone from exercising their religion. That's not tied to race. That's tied to the exercise of religion. So we see here, for example, activity that supports allegations of more than one intent as well. Now, with respect to issues that you raise about the defendant's state of mind, of course, all of that will be taken into consideration as this case goes forward. I'm not able to speculate now as to what impact any other factors would have on the case.
Yes, you suggested that this was a 7-month plan. Can you elaborate a little bit about how detailed this plan was, whether he made trips to the church prior to that night, June 17th?
Well, okay. Thank you for the question. Well, I'm not able to go into how many months he was planning. It was several months prior to the June 17th incident, and I'm not able to go into the evidence right now that would show his actions surrounding that at this point.
Now, following up on Ryan's point, should there be a federal domestic terrorism law? Because for your average person who sees the way people in law enforcement talk about different types of killings with different words, what distinction should they make when they hear talk about a shooting in Chattanooga as terrorism, but a shooting here as hate crime? Does it matter, and should there be a domestic terrorism law?
Well, as to what laws should or should not come out as a result of this investigation, I'm not going to speculate at this point in time. As to the nature of the case, though, I think you touch on the issue that people may feel that because we have such a strong emphasis on terrorism matters since 9/11, that when we talk about matters and don't use that terminology, that somehow we don't consider those crimes as serious. And I want to be clear, nothing could be further from the truth than that. This type of crime in particular, racially motivated violence, for which a federal law was specifically enacted to cover, is of grave importance to the federal government. We have devoted considerable resources from the beginning of this case to make sure that this interest was explored, and that if in fact the evidence supported it, that the allegations were brought. Because this is in fact the archetype of the original domestic terrorism. And I think sometimes people do focus on the terminology because, as I've mentioned, since 9/11, there has been a great focus on that type of case. But it should in no way, in absolutely no way, signify that this particular murder or any federal crime is of any lesser significance.
How will you determine whether or not he is a candidate for the death penalty?
The Department of Justice has a process by which we consider death-eligible defendants in determining whether or not to seek that penalty. It is a very detailed and thorough review process. It involves submissions from defense counsel. It involves consultation with the victims' families, and it involves a review of all the various factors that we would utilize to seek the death penalty to determine whether or not we feel that we could prevail on those factors at a trial. Ultimately, after this review process, which is both at the U.S. Attorney's Office level, it is then also here in Maine Justice, and ultimately it comes to my desk where I make the ultimate decision whether or not to seek the death penalty in any death-eligible case. As I've said before, I do want to be clear that no decision has been made at this point in time as to whether or not to seek that penalty, but we do have an obligation to place the defendant on notice that the penalty is an option and to allow his counsel the time to begin to prepare to make those submissions.
Can you talk a little bit about what your office is doing in conjunction with the FBI? Can you talk a little bit about what your office is doing in conjunction with the FBI to sort of close some of the issues that came up with him getting the gun in the first place?
Well, as Director Comey announced, I think about 10 days ago, he has initiated a review into the procedures that allowed that unfortunately led to us missing the fact that Mr. Ruth had applied to purchase that gun. This is a matter of grave importance. It's something that was very disturbing and frankly heartbreaking to all of us who were reviewing this matter. So that investigation is ongoing, and I look forward to receiving the results from it.
On a slightly different topic, yesterday you said you were looking at the Bland case. Can you expand on that? Are you officially monitoring? Will you open an investigation?
You're referring to Ms. Bland, who died in Texas while in police custody. As noted, that matter is actually under investigation by local authorities. The FBI is monitoring that case, as we often do in many situations, and we're awaiting the results of local investigations as well.
Ma'am, could you talk a little bit about what your views are on the Planned Parenthood videos that have been out? I know you've received some letters from members of Congress. You know, there is an applicable federal law here, and is that something that you are going to open an investigation on?
Well, I'm aware of those matters generally from the media and from some inquiries that have been made to the Department of Justice. And again, at this point, we're going to review all the information and determine what steps, if any, to take at the appropriate time.
Thanks, General. Just switching gears on OPM, can we expect any charges to come from the Department of Justice tied to the perpetrators of the OPM breach?
You refer to the opium breach of personal data. That's an ongoing investigation, an open matter, so I'm really not able to comment at this time as to what charges may or may not result with that. What I will say, however, is that the Department of Justice, as well as other federal agencies, are actively involved in notifying everyone who is subjected to that breach and providing them with the tools necessary to protect their personal data.
Lynch, the families of the victims down in South Carolina, your reaction to how they've responded to the very difficult circumstances?
I think from the beginning, the families of the victims of the Mother Emanuel shooting have provided an example to the country of what true grace and true spirit and true faith looks like. I think they are an inspiration to us all. I frankly do not know how many of us would be able to find that type of forgiveness in our hearts so soon after such a terrible, terrible, heartbreaking loss. In particular, I thought what was very helpful for everyone watching that was to see that the families acknowledged that they were angry. They did, in fact, have anger towards the person who had taken their loved ones, but they were able to, while still holding on to that anger, still move to forgiveness. I thought that was an incredible lesson and message for all of us.
General Lynch, it's been some time now since your office in New York began the investigation into the death of Eric Garner. When can we expect a resolution? Are you close to that?
Well, I can't comment on the timing of that investigation except to say that it is still active, it is still ongoing, and the Eastern District of New York is moving ahead with that investigation in a thorough and efficient manner.
We'll take one more question.
Given that more people on U.S. soil have been killed by non-Muslim radicals or extremists since 9/11, do you think that you're properly organizing resources to focus on the domestic terrorism threat?
Well, we are tracking a number of threats aimed at Americans on U.S. soil and abroad. And certainly the death of any American, the death of anyone, is a matter of grave importance for us here in the federal government. Without commenting on how we're allocating resources, I would simply say that we take all threats seriously, whether they come from a foreign terrorist organization, a domestic militia organization, or simply an individual who posts threats online. We take all those matters very seriously and devote what we feel are the resources necessary to, first of all, protect individuals who come under those threats, and if in fact we learn of the matter too late, to vindicate their interest and bring the killers to justice. Thank you all.